Thank you very much. Are there any paediatric nurses here? Could you put your hands up if there's any paediatric nurses? That's interesting. When I did my nurse training, my adult nurse training, in 1980, I was on my paediatric placement, and at the end of it, Sister Diamond said to me, Dennis, she said, "You're not a paediatric nurse and you never will be." And then she said, "You weren't thinking of becoming a paediatric nurse, were you?" And I said, "Not now." So what I want to talk about today, though, despite not being a paediatric nurse and never likely to be one, is risk assessment of children. Now, I feel a bit of a fraud here because a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about I had very little to do with at all, and a lot of this work has been done by Jane Willock, who is a paediatric nurse. So I would mention her as being the basis behind certainly at least one of these tools I'm going to talk about. That's Leicestershire, for those of you that have never heard of Leicestershire. We are a little bit better known now. So pressure ulcers do occur in children. We're increasingly being aware of this, and indeed there is a paediatric tissue viability network coordinated from Glasgow but UK-wide. It's got a small but select membership, and if anybody were to be interested, I can put you in contact with the convener of that. We do know some of the causes of pressure ulcers in children, and they're not the same necessarily as those in adults. So therefore, taking an adult tool and just sticking it onto children isn't going to necessarily work. For example, the Waterlow score has one of its sub-scores as age. Well, all the children are going to score in the bottom rank of that. So if you're comparing children's risk with other children's risk, that doesn't really help as one of the sub-scores. Other sub-scores are things like, do you smoke? Again, not usually that helpful, although my father-in-law started smoking at 5 and I started at about 12, so for some children maybe, but usually not. Now, we do have some risk assessment tools. I think Mike wrote many, many years ago, in the front row here, that there was at least 42 different risk assessment tools, and that was a long time ago. There's a lot more now. And I know that for children there's at least 7. There's probably more than 7, but I can count 7. Now, the problem with knowing about how big the problem is that we're looking at is that a lot of the studies aren't very good. But if you include only the high quality papers, then there is probably about 1% of children get pressure ulcers, but the different collects are very, very different. So, for example, paediatric intensive care gets a much higher level of pressure ulcers than some other areas. So much higher incidence and prevalence in PICUs. In one study, as much as 35% of children were said to have pressure ulcers, but these were mostly very, very minor. However, there are 1 or 2 quite severe pressure ulcers. So when I was talking to colleagues in Leeds about looking at risk assessment tools, they weren't very, very interested in that because they said that they were really only interested in the serious ulcers, which were few in number, but those were the ones that presented them with problems. And indeed, in one study, even months afterwards, there was a couple of pressure ulcers that were still severe. So these are some of the causes in adults. I'm not going to linger on this slide because, I mean, don't we all know all of this sort of stuff? And these are posited as the things in children that cause pressure ulcers. So it's actually the younger children who are more likely to get pressure ulcers, particularly very young children, particularly if they're preterm neonates. And obviously morbidity scores, serum albumin, and also some less well-documented ones like ethnicity. I don't think ethnicity's got very much to do with pressure ulcers. There are a few not very good quality studies which indicate that it is in adults relevant, but when I looked at it I found that it wasn't. One of the problems was that in adults, certain ethnic groups are of a different age than other ethnic groups, and that's why actually they have different levels of pressure ulcers. I don't think there's any evidence in children that it has any impact at all. So what we were looking at were two hospital setups. One was in the King Abdullah University Hospital in Irbid in Jordan. That was because I happened to have a PhD student who was located in that hospital, and she was a paediatric nurse and interested in pressure ulcers. And when she went back and got her substantive position in Jordan, she did an incident study in intensive care units, paediatric intensive care units. And colleagues in Brisbane, they were looking at all paediatric admissions, not just PICUs, but right across the board, including general paediatric wards. And these were the percentages of males and the percentage of critical care admissions, and the numbers of people numbers of children in each place that developed pressure ulcers. So you can see it's single digits, but most of these were quite minor. If we look at the severe pressure ulcers, however, they do exist. We didn't have any grade 4, fortunately, but we did have a few grade 3. And this is in, about 500 children. So of about 500 children, you have 3 or 4 severe pressure ulcers. So that's definitely something that's worth being worried about. Now, what we're looking at here is 2 risk tools in both units, both in King Abdullah and in Brisbane. We compared the Braden Q with the Glamorgan. Now, the Braden Q is based on an adult score, the Braden score, and is essentially very similar to it. They've added an item. My reasoning was, why would you use an adult score on children? But they have validated it, and it does seem to predict that children are going to go on to develop pressure ulcers. And they have done some inter-rate reliability, and they have shown that it is a reliable tool. So it's not a priori nonsense to use Braden Q. The Glamorgan score is a completely different genesis. This was developed by Jane Willock, who is actually English, although she was working in Wales at the time when she developed it. And not being a very modest person, she didn't name it the Willock score. She named it the Glamorgan score. Now, what she did was she looked at risks in children. She talked to a lot of paediatric nurse specialists and said, what do you think of the risk factors? She then collected those risk factors. So she did some statistical analysis to see whether they were different in children that had pressure ulcers and those that didn't. She then included those that were significantly different, and she then weighted them differently according to the clinical experience informed from her paediatric colleagues. So you could say this is from a bottom-up one, not a tool that's just been lifted and used in children, but one that's been generated for children. So we thought it'd be useful to compare them. Now, what we're looking at here, the ROC curve, that diagonal line across the graph is the guessing line. Anything above that guessing line is something that's better than guessing. And the further it is towards the top left-hand corner, the better the tool is. And you can see here that the Braden score and the Glamorgan score seem to be quite similar. And if you look at the area under the curve, which is the numerical measure, although the Braden score scores higher, so therefore you would think it's the better tool, and it may be, the confidence interval of the 2 scoring systems overlap a lot, so there's no real evidence that one's better than the other. The difference between them could be due to chance. But our best guess is that the Braden score may be slightly better than the Glamorgan score on the overall population. But it's quite possible that that doesn't mean anything at all. Now, I'll just go through it. Now, we then split it by unit, because children are different from adults, but PICU children may be very different from the general paediatric population. So we thought it'd be useful to look at neonatal intensive care, paediatric intensive care, and the general wards to see whether... now, we're getting to quite small numbers here, which is a good news for the children concerned, but it means that it becomes more and more difficult to know with any statistical certainty whether there's differences. But it does look like in PICUs, the Glamorgan and Braden Q are remarkably similar. There's really nothing to choose between them. For NICUs, it's similar, but for general paediatric wards, it does look like there's a larger difference between the two scoring systems. But there's, again, quite a lot of overlap, but not that much. When I say there's a little bit of overlap, not a great deal. So you could be arguing here that in the intensive care units, it probably doesn't much matter which tool you use, but in paediatric general wards, it could well be that the Braden Q is better, even though it was designed for adults and the Glamorgan score was designed for children, which is not what I was expecting to see. If you take grade 1 ulcers out, because we're more interested in the higher grade scores, then again, there isn't a great deal of difference between the Glamorgan score and the Braden Q. The Braden Q scores slightly better, but it probably doesn't mean anything because the confidence intervals are so overlapping. So what are the strengths of this study? Well, it's the first one to consider NICUs. Using these two scales. A lot of studies of paediatric risk assessment tools look at one paediatric risk assessment tool and don't compare it to anything else. So this is the first one that's comparing two of them, and they're two very commonly used ones. The Glamorgan scale's in use in many different countries, not just Wales or indeed the UK. It's in use in all the countries in the UK. It's used in Ireland, it's used in Australia, it's used in New Zealand, South Africa, Germany, the Netherlands. I've got a long list of countries it's used. And Braden Q is also used in a lot of different locations, not just America where it was developed, but in many other countries. But one of the problems is, although we've got a reasonably large sample, the number of pressure ulcers is quite small, which is a good thing, but means for the stats it's difficult to come up with too much, over-interpret what we've found. So the results are probably robust, but we think that probably general paediatrics, maybe the Braden Q is better, NICU, PICU probably doesn't much matter. Now, I would like to say one thing here, that I'm just looking at risk assessment tools and seeing which one predicts pressure ulcers better than another one. But is that the really important thing? Because I would have said the important thing is, does using a risk assessment tool reduce incidence? And this is a question asked of me many years ago by a tissue viability nurse in the Northeast, because I'd been saying in a talk that we use these tools because they should reduce pressure ulcer incidence by alerting us to the risk of the patient. And she just immediately said to me, and does it? And I have to admit, I had no idea. So I got a student of mine, Mohammed, who was Jordanian again, but he was working in Saudi Arabia, and we split the clinical area into three. In one set of wards, we implemented the Braden score, not the Braden Q, these are adults, the Braden score, with education on how to use it. And in another three wards, we just put in the education, and in another three wards, we didn't do anything at all. And pressure ulcers reduced in all three groups, A, B, and C, but the one it improved the most, although it was not statistically significant, was in the control unit where we did nothing, which devastated Mohammed, and I just thought it was hilarious. We have very little evidence that pressure ulcer risk assessment was reducing incidence, but if you implement something like a risk tool and have a big launch, then it probably will reduce, but it's quite likely to be the Hawthorne effect, which isn't a bad thing, but that's what's done it, not the risk tool itself. Since then, there's been a more robust study done which showed no difference between clinical judgment and risk assessment tools in adults. There has been no work done on children. So if you were to ask me, does using any of these risk tools actually have the clinical effect of reducing pressure ulcers, I have no idea. So I'm trying to do a study that will actually answer that. And if anybody's interested, has colleagues in the paediatric area, then contact me, because if I get funding, then I'm going to be looking for areas to do this study. Because everything I've said up to now is not really very helpful if the risk tool doesn't reduce incidence. So the conclusions are the Braden, Kew and Glamorgan, they're probably quite similar actually, even though they come from completely different starting points, and one would have thought that Glamorgan should have done better. But I'd just like to finish by saying, when I travel a lot, and say I come from Leicester, people have no idea where I come from, but they do know now because we're number one at the moment. Now, it could be that Tottenham will catch us up, but hopefully not. 5,000 to 1, incidentally, the total amount of money bet on Leicester was £68.20. But there was one guy that put 20 quid on, and he stood to gain 100,000, and he ducked out a couple of weeks ago. Littlewoods took it back at 29,000 because he couldn't take the stress anymore. Anyway, thank you very much for your attendance. And the talk has just been is based on a paper which has only just been published. It's published electronically at the moment. It's not in, but it will be in a later copy of the journal. So thanks very much.